Hello, everybody, and welcome back to New 332. Um, as you may have noticed, this has all been a little slow going lately and at the busiest time of year, so I'm getting caught up gradually. And thank you, I appreciate your patience. So, the last lecture was Buddhism's Nine. We were talking about, um, at some length, the jhanas. And unfortunately, for reasons that elude me, I lost the sound at the very end of that recording. So the last bunch of minutes, for some reason, had no sound. Not sure why. Maybe it's from getting fancy and filming things remotely from a different location. So we've switched back to the classic setup for the time being. But I can summarize the end of that lecture very briefly and thus lead into this lecture, which is Psychotherapies 9. So we were talking about the jhanas, and the jhanas is kind of an advanced set of experiences which are possible through meditation, right? An advanced set of sort of concentrations, meditations, contemplations, which become possible leading through into mystical experience. And my um, my sort of suggestion, I suppose, to summarize at the end of that lecture was to consider two things, right? First off, to consider, um, unusual experiences you yourself have had, right? So to think broadly speaking about, peak experiences, to use the Maslow term, or flow states, or if you've been, the sort of person who has experienced visionary experiences, right, or mystical experiences. These things are comparatively rarer, but you can think about the sort of the lower end of those experiences, right? Ones that don't break through into a sense of cosmic significance per se, but the moments where you are having a really strong sense of sort of the high end of positive psychology, awe, wonder, right? A sense of sort of timelessness, a sense of breaking through. Many people in peak experiences, that's Maslow's term, peak experiences, or in sort of really intensive flow states, will have these kinds of things where time and the sense of self falls away. Those indeed are sort of signature features of Csikszentmihalyi's flow experience. Um, but it is possible for that to become, elevated into this more intensive state. Um, and it's not unusual for people to experience, under certain conditions, experiences of awe. Um, the Grand Canyon and other kinds of natural wonders often induce that kind of awe. People quite frequently experience it when they have sort of moments of biophilia, to borrow Wilson's term. I was on a call with somebody the other day, and while they were out for their walk here in Toronto, they saw three coyotes, and they were wrapped in a pretty intensive, emotional, distressed conversation at the time. But they saw these coyotes just about their business, and this sort of stopped them in their tracks, right? It just completely occupied their attention and connected them through to the natural world in this really powerful, sweeping way. Um, I think it's possible to have experiences like that. It's possible, of course, to have such experiences, totally spontaneously. Just walking along and you're sort of looking at the sky, and all of a sudden there is a tremendous sense of opening. So the first thing that I wanted to say was to contemplate those own moments in your life, the moments of these kind of crystal clarity, the moments when time and your sense of self seems to drop away, right? Touching at that kind of level of cosmic significance or mystical significance. Um, so that was the first thing. The second thing that I wanted you to consider was, to look into the jhanas and consider what are, in fact, the possibilities of human experience. Because this, at the end of the day, is fairly integral to the question of the paths of Buddhism, right? As humans, obviously, we're tremendously malleable, and I was touching on this, right? We can sort of train ourselves in a tremendous number of directions, right? Where as beings, we're remarkably plastic. We've at this point, I suspect, all heard about neuroplasticity, but the crux of neuroplasticity isn't just merely our ability to learn; it's our ability to become different sorts of things. Um, and when you read accounts of the jhanas, these states of mystical absorption, it's very easy to look at those things and say, really? Like, is that really a thing? And yet the evidence seems to weigh that it is. I have known a number of people who have had such experiences, and I, by times, have had such experiences. And they were unquestionably among the most profound experiences of my life, life changing in many ways. So the two kind of recommendations that I was making were less about a meditative technique per se, because it's very hard in a certain sense to offer a meditative technique that's going to invariably lead to mystical experience. But you can contemplate, of course, where your own experience has touched that space, right? And there is a kind of lasting, reverberating clarity that often comes out of such things. And then you can look at the research, right? Look at the jhanas, look at the descriptions of these things, and ask yourself, are these possible states of experience? And if so, what are they worth to me? What is it worth, right? This is one of these sort of abiding questions that, right, is going to be running through this course. I mean, if it is indeed possible to obtain such experiences, why? And the answer, of course, that I would tend to give is that because they are profoundly transformative. They're profoundly transformative of ourselves, profoundly transformative of our relationships to people in the world, profoundly transformative of our sense of being, right? And of the possibilities of being. So there is a kind of opening up. Now, I think, for good reason, very often, the actual practice of Buddhism and other religious paths tends not to focus so much on that, because it can be a kind of lure, right? It can lead to a certain kind of spiritual bypass. Like, people are aiming for this mystical state, and so they're not placing, an appropriate emphasis on ethical conduct and a variety of the other things that, sort of inform and buttress. But it is equally mistaken, in my opinion, to ignore the possibility of those states. So that was sort of my general pitch for the end of that last lecture, which got cut off. You can watch me pantomime it if you wish and hold up books, but that was the general thrust. And that leads fairly neatly into the subject for Psychotherapies 9, which is I wanted to talk a little bit about psychedelic psychotherapy. Now, I know that this is very much a hot topic. And when I say hot, I mean it's still somewhat controversial. It seems to me that the sort of popular penetration of this sort of stuff is increasing day over day. And I have often said, when I've spoken at conferences and such on the subject, that it's strange a little bit for me, because this has been a fairly long-standing interest of mine in terms of sort of research and theory, and indeed of the application of these things to mental health purposes. And yet, when I was sort of first looking into discussing these things, they were really still quite off limits. It was prior to what we are now calling the Psychedelic Renaissance, right? Which is this sort of period really in the last 10 years where this research has been taken up, and it has been a remarkable flowering. More or less, you started to see some cracks in the dam with the work by Griffiths et al. At Johns Hopkins. And gradually from there were a few other sort of tentative studies that emerged. And since then, it has become an absolute flood. I'm amazed at how much of this research is being produced. And frankly, in my opinion, that research is overdue. I attended the opening of the new center at Harvard that's going to be studying these things, virtually, of course. But I attended the opening a few weeks ago of the new center at Harvard that is going to be working on these things. And it was an interesting experience. It was sort of hosted in some sense by Michael Pollan, who's a journalist, who wrote a book a couple of years ago on his own investigations into sort of psychedelics and the transformative power of them, called How to Change Your Mind. A book which I haven't read, mostly because, I just haven't gotten around to it. I don't own a copy, interestingly, although probably I'll buy one because I'm a bit compulsive in that respect. But it was hosted by Michael Pollan, and he was sort of talking about this stuff. And of course, it was the whole team of scientists from different disciplines who are going to be working together. And it was a very conservative group in some ways. And in many respects, I think that is the right move for them to make, right? It's about an air of sober respectability. And especially so for Harvard, which really was the kind of cradle where the original psychedelic burst of the 60s emerged from, with Timothy Leary and the Harvard Psychedelic Club. And if you know anything about that research in the 1960s, you will understand why Harvard has been sort of reticent and cautious in this area, because the Harvard Psychedelic Club, for all of the promise that it held out in terms of the research, was really a pretty unmitigated disaster. Timothy Leary, gradually came to be, frankly, quite cavalier about the use of psychedelics, and their experimental protocols were you would gasp in some ways when you considered the ethics. I mean, they ran an experiment giving LSD to participants in the basement of a church, and somebody got loose. Like, they crawled out the window and went running down the street. And it's hard to imagine in the current wave of research anything like this happening. Everybody has been exceptionally cautious and exceptionally slow. But it took many years to get back to this point, right? We had a burst of this research really flowering in the 60s. There was some in the 50s. Some of these compounds like LSD synthesized in the 40s, right? Albert Hofmann in 43 synthesized LSD. Mescaline had been isolated many years before. Psilocybin mushrooms, received a great deal of attention from Gordon Wasson. And, there was a number of these kinds of compounds that began to be investigated. If you go back and you look, I have some really vintage Scientific Americans that collect published articles by some of these people, and the sense of potential and wonder that passes through many of these experimenters is, they identify correctly that it's nothing short of revolutionary, the effects that these things have. And if you go back and you look at old papers, it indeed is quite remarkable. However, the way that it filtered into the popular culture, right, it really linked up with the kind of revolutionary movements of the 60s more broadly. And pretty soon it was being identified as, sort of a major driver of youth dissent and social unrest. And so Richard Nixon basically stepped in as American president and clamped everything. There was movements that prior, but there's this real clamping down, and research becomes impossible. And that general policy of the clamping down sort of continues, with the United States really taking the lead, everybody else kind of following their lead in a lot of respects, such that, one by one, many of these compounds, many of which had seen some significant application in sort of psychotherapeutic circles, right, began to be sort of one by one scheduled and made illegal or inaccessible. So an interesting example of this is MDMA, right, popularly known as ecstasy or Molly. So MDMA as a compound wasn't scheduled until 1982, quite late. And when the FDA went to schedule it, a number of researchers who were doing work with it, including Claudio Naranjo, wrote a letter. These were psychotherapists, but wrote a letter basically begging the FDA not to schedule this substance because of the tremendous application that they had been finding with it in terms of couples therapy. Now, MDMA as a substance is an interesting one. It's not sort of a classical psychedelic in this sense. And so, obviously in our discussion, we'll be covering sort of a wider range of things than merely classical psychedelics. But the interesting thing about it is that it tends to massively reduce anxiety and create a sense of empathic opening. And so you can see how in couples work, right, having a couple who's taking MDMA in a guided kind of setting might facilitate the sorts of conversations that are often really difficult to have in couples work, right? The sort of disclosure, the open communication, but also the sense of empathic connection that's necessary to make sort of couples therapy go forward. So they begged the FDA not to schedule it. The FDA did. And that is the sort of general policy that we see in this sort of stuff. It just gets banned. And the war on drugs straight through the 80s and the 90s was really pretty continuous. And then we start to see something of an opening up. As I previously mentioned, I think one of the really seminal pieces in this respect is the work at Johns Hopkins. The work at Johns Hopkins, which was using specifically psilocybin. So psilocybin being the extracted or occasionally synthesized extract of magic mushrooms. So it's naturally occurring in the sense that it occurs in many breeds of mushrooms, and has been used sort of ritually, right, by indigenous cultures in many locations for centuries or thousands of years. Now that right there is a pattern that we'll often find. Obviously, some of these compounds are sort of synthetic. They don't occur in nature. So Mdma is synthetic so far as we know. There's no naturally occurring analog of it. LSD, likewise, is exceptionally powerful and synthetic. But many of these compounds do, in fact, occur in various places in nature. So psilocybin in mushrooms, mescaline in cactuses, and substances like DMT, which can be synthesized, but is also sort of an integral component of the indigenous formulation, the Amazonian indigenous formulation of ayahuasca, which you may also have heard about. So we'll talk a little bit about all of these things. So the work at Johns Hopkins was interesting because it was using psilocybin, but it was using it in a very specific context. It was using it to provoke mystical experiences. And this is where we start to see some continuity, right? Obviously, with the concept of the jhanas. Now, the premise of that work, was to study mystical experiences and the effect of mystical experiences. But what's kind of interesting is that implicit in that research is the idea that a psilocybin-induced mystical experience is indistinguishable and therefore identical to any other kind of mystical experience. So although it's possible to have a fully sort of spontaneous mystical experience, as it were, and it also seems possible to reach or attain mystical experiences through meditative practice and concentration or other kinds of ritual practices, right? Also it seems to be possible through the administration of some substances under the right set and setting and dosage and so on and so forth to produce these kinds of powerful experiences. Now, the notion of the mystical experience, such as it is in study, is, it's something that, sees periodic debate in terms of what its core components are. But there are a few things that we can sort of look at that generalize between the different models. So there is this real sense of sort of the opening of the boundary of self, right? So there is, if not a merger, a kind of opening into experience. There is the opening of sort of space and time in some sense. There is the dissolution of the customary sense of self, which we can see obviously as being quite similar to certain concepts in Buddhism. And with that, often there is a kind of a dropping away of certain kinds of persistent sort of mental experiences. So the mind changes quite radically. This tends to coincide with high levels of insight. It may also, of course, be a visionary state, right? So to distinguish between the mystical and the visionary, right? The mystical has that kind of opening effect, but it's not primarily experienced in terms of like hallucination. Whereas the visionary often comes with, right, significant additional material, sensory material, right? One sees things, hears things, etc. So it's sort of vaguely dreamlike. That's a bit imprecise as a term, but you get the idea. So the Griffiths lab work at Johns Hopkins treated the experiences that were elicited by psilocybin as being functionally identical to other mystical experiences. And when you look at their research around this, what's strikingly interesting, right, is how significant people deem this, but also the effect that it has upon them. So one often discussed effect, right, is that there is a shift in openness, right? So openness is one of the big 5 personality measures. It tends to sort of decline over time and age to some extent, right? People tend to kind of, they lock into their current configurations. But a single administration of psilocybin seemed to increase people's sense of openness and opened them back up to experience in many ways, which is quite remarkable. The big five personality measures are typically deemed to be not static, but sort of relatively speaking, fixed, right? They don't typically bounce around much. They don't shift too much. Once they're set, they're kind of set, and there are some trends in them. But this was a quite significant, statistically significant increase. It seemed to be persistent over time. Now, that particular increase in openness is one of the things that has attracted a great deal of attention around psychedelic psychotherapy, because the increase in openness also seems to coincide with sort of increased experiences of insight. And as we'll discuss in the next lecture, insight is one of these features of psychotherapy that is somewhat debatable in terms of its indispensability. Actually, there are some problems around strictly insight-based models and some differentiations that we need to make there. But nevertheless, right, it's a pretty classical feature of the psychotherapeutic experience to suddenly have an insight about oneself or an insight about one's relationships, and these indeed seem to facilitate that. There is also a kind of radical reframing that accompanies these kinds of experiences, where, in a sense, one's sort of ego-bound preoccupations tend to, if not drop away, become highly relativized. And in addition to that, it seems that mystical experiences often occasion an increase in the sense of one's kind of coherence, right? The coherence of one's world. And thereby, that seems to mediate an increased sense of meaning in life, right? Now, just to talk on that very briefly, we're talking about meaning in life and not the meaning of life, although people obviously sometimes walk away from these experiences with a sense of that too. But the sense of meaning in life is the idea of, right, that your life is meaningful, right? That your actions are meaningful, that you're meaningfully connected, that you have a sense of purpose and place, that, that what you are doing matters, right? And you can see how that sense of meaning in life can be extremely powerfully transformative. There is a kind of underlying aspect of depression, for instance, right? That often revolves around that sense of meaninglessness, right? And it is, I think, to a significant extent, exacerbated by the condition of modern culture. I don't think that it's necessarily so, but for many people, the transition into the scientific worldview has left them bereft in many ways, right? So, from sort of the Newtonian period of, switching from the world being a kind of a living thing, right? Or a divine creation, to suddenly being sort of atoms in the void, right? It's just particles bouncing around and random, and there's no purpose to anything, right? That's a shocking view for many people. Likewise, natural selection, right? The sort of general Darwinian theory of evolution has left people with this sense that it's like, oh, right, there isn't a plan. It's just sort of randomness constrained by circumstances and opportunistically filling through replication. And this is, for many people, right, it can, of course, be a source of wonder to consider it. And I think actually many scientists do experience wonder when they consider things in this way. But for many people, what this does is sort of remove the old sense of sort of a meaningful structure to life. And replace it with just evolution. And you can hear this when you talk to people sometimes when they're in a relatively sort of low meaning or depressive state of mind. So it's not uncommon for people, for instance, to deploy it as something of a defense mechanism if they've had romantic disappointment of various kinds, either in terms of sort of breakup or not meeting people, where people will default into a kind of biological determinism with regard to their relationships, right? It's all just genes. We're just gene robots, and we're just gene robots following the dictates of our genes, and nothing matters and nothing is meaningful, so it's irrelevant. Now, I probably won't get into it so much here, but in general, I advocate and have advocated in many of my courses and lectures for a fairly radically kind of experiential phenomenological approach to these kinds of states. And I don't think that kind of nihilism is necessarily bad. I actually think it can be quite useful. I think that it's something that you can very carefully, deliberately seek, and it's important to know how to do so. It's a very different thing to sort of walk into the lair, walk into the cave on purpose and find your way back out than it is to suddenly find yourself falling into it. And, you know, entering into those kinds of states, if one does so somewhat deliberately, you know, sort of inoculates one, as it were, and gives them better tools to come back out. But also, you know, as I've spoken, certainly in class discussions and in many other lectures, you know, there's a kind of slider. I mean, there's a whole set of sliders, but there's like a slider in our phenomenology, you know, from meaning and you know, between meaning and meaninglessness. And people very often make the assumption, I think, because people are relatively low meaning, that that what you want is more meaning, right? People will sometimes say, and clients will often say, right, they just want like a meaningful, magical, interconnected experience all the time. I would tend to contest this. I don't think that that's actually true. And the reason I say this is that when you look at people who do experience that kind of heightened sense of meaning all the time, it's often quite uncomfortable. So for instance, that it typically accompanies things like schizotypal and schizophrenic thinking, right? The incredible sense of symbolic, you know, interconnection and meaning. And it becomes totally overwhelming, right? Indeed, it can become quite paranoid. And so, you know, if everything appears interconnected and it seems interconnected to your thoughts at all moments, if you happen to be in a good frame of mind, then, you know, that will tend to be construed and interpreted as, well, God loves me and everything is right in the world. But if it gets, you know, construed according to the negative, then all of a sudden, right, those connections and that sense of meaning becomes the CIA is reading my thoughts. Or if it progresses even further and sort of, you know, sinks roots into the sense of metaphysics, it can become, you know, I am trapped in a Gnostic hell dimension. Like, these experiences can be really unpleasant and powerful. And as I will sometimes say to people who think that they want sort of nonstop meaning, it's like, anybody who's ever in fact had a significant psychedelic trip, especially a lengthy one like LSD, which tends to go on for quite a while, when you reach the far side of that, you don't want more meaning. You want a nice meaningless day. You want things to just be what they are, simple objects, you know, sit and eat your oatmeal, and like, right, not for things to mean other things and mean other things in sort of an endless kind of construal that can be kind of exhausting. Likewise, as I've said, right, this idea of this sort of slider that exists, right, between you know, free will and determinism that I've talked about before, is the kind of thing that I actually think people want to be mobile. You know, people think that they want this sense of free will all the time and more, but actually in practice that is not true. Sometimes you just want things to be mechanism, right? You want them to be less free willed, more deterministic, and you know, as a good example, right, virtually anytime I have a client who approaches and they're experiencing depression, the first thing that I have them go to is get their thyroid tested, because if you have thyroid dysfunction, this can manifest as depression, and it is relatively easily treatable with, you know, sort of safe, effective medication. And so, if indeed it's the case that you can, you know, intervene on sort of these states that are afflicting you, and just do so in a way, right, that's like, it turns out that indeed, like, I'm a bit of a robot, and I just needed to sort of fix my thyroid and now I'm fine. That's usually a tremendous relief for people. Likewise, right, the example that I use sometimes is like, if your normally kindly grandmother suddenly starts screaming obscenities at you and calling you terrible names or something, it's actually a relief typically to find out that there is like a strict biological deterministic reason for this. Right? I mean, it's not a relief because it means your grandmother is sick, but it is a relief because it means your grandmother isn't hurling this at you. It's not her, right? So that idea of the slider between free will versus determinism, sometimes you want more and sometimes you want less, and you want it mobile, also applies to the sense of sort of meaning versus nihilism, right? Sometimes you want things to mean less and sometimes you want them to mean more. Nevertheless, it is one of the sort of signature effects of a proper mystical experience that people come out with when they have mystical experience, including psychedelically induced mystical experience, they come out with this significantly enhanced sense of coherence, right? That things are bound together in a meaningful way that includes them and connects to the world, right? And that in turn produces an increased sense of meaning in life, which, right, does all sorts of things. It, in many ways, in fact, seems to kind of replicate the effects of religious immersion, in which one has sort of a received meaning in life, right, by connecting through to the sort of ideology and metaphysics. In many ways of religion, one gets a sense of place, right, and one gets a sense of purpose, and one gets a sense of, right, sort of their arc, right, what they're supposed to be doing. Okay, so yeah, when the Griffiths lab broke this stuff open, we started to see this rise, and there's been a lot of interesting work. There was an interesting study in Switzerland looking at improving end-of-life outcomes. So this was cancer patients who they administered LSD to, and who, the sort of folk psychology around this would say that if you, gave somebody who was a, terminally ill patient with cancer LSD, that oh no, like what an unpleasant freakout this would be. But that's not what happened. What happened instead is they had a very powerful experience, which in the end reduced their death anxiety considerably, right? It seemed to allow them to connect through. Likewise, there has been significant attention paid to the role of sort of psychedelic psychotherapy in questions of addiction. So ayahuasca, which I previously mentioned, is an indigenous Amazonian brew. It's kind of compounded together from different plants. Loosely speaking, it contains sort of two components. So it contains DMT in one of the components, but DMT is almost instantly broken down by an enzyme in your body. If you ingest it, your body metabolizes that, breaks it down almost immediately. DMT occurs in small amounts endogenously, so your brain produces small amounts of DMT apparently. Although we keep looking for this, there are a lot of claims that there's a big source of DMT, and what role does that have? The evidence is mixed, but it does seem like there is some endogenous DMT, but in small amounts. But when you ingest DMT, normally your body breaks it down almost immediately. And so the second part of ayahuasca is a sort of another plant which contains an MAO inhibitor. So MAO is the enzyme which breaks it down. And so what this then does is, by inhibiting the MAO, right, it allows the DMT to build up to a significant level within the bloodstream and to pass the blood-brain barrier in a significant concentration. That also has a secondary effect, because MAO inhibitors tend to have a relatively broad spectrum antidepressant effect generally. Indeed, there was a whole class of antidepressants developed that are just MAO inhibitors prior to sort of the more modern SSRIs and SNRIs. And those MAO inhibitor drugs, among other things, they sometimes raise dopamine levels, and right, they have this sort of effect on endogenous neurotransmitters. So you're administering with ayahuasca, then, if we want to look at it in strictly pharmacological terms, you're administering a fairly powerful antidepressant substance at the same time as you're experiencing DMT, which is an extremely powerful visionary substance. Now, when it's administered in its sort of indigenous context, this is done so ritually. It's brewed as a tea, and people drink it. It's quite foul tasting. People drink it, and it's also a pretty powerful emetic. So people often throw up, and often they also void. So their GI tract in general is quite activated, but then they enter a really powerful visionary state that lasts for many hours. And the visionary state, is sort of is a bit confrontational, as it were. It tends to sort of show one things in their past. It may have more abstract content, but it sort of facilitates a really hard look at one's behaviors. And interestingly, for some combination of pharmacological and visionary reasons, which have not been completely untangled, this often has a really powerful effect on substance abuse problems. So ayahuasca has been used often successfully, and this has been championed by a number of relatively high-profile people. Dr. Gabor Mate has spoken about it and was working with it pretty extensively until Health Canada sort of clamped down on it. You know, as an anti-addictive potential, often it has this sort of highly spiritual awakening quality where people walk out and you know, no longer want to engage in the same kind of patterns. They feel sort of intensely transformed. Quite a bit less well known, but something that I'm quite familiar with and the research around is another drug. It's an African ritual drug called Iboga tabernanthe. The active component of which is ibogaine. Active component is a bit misleading. People do isolate ibogaine or ibogaine from the roots of Iboga tabernanthe, which is an evergreen shrub, and the substance in question grows in the root bark of the plant. So this grows in Gabon and Cameroon and some parts of Congo, and it's used indigenously in the Bwiti faith. Or apparently was originally discovered by the Pygmies who lived in the area, and it was taken up by other people in the area. And the Bwiti faith is a syncretic faith, meaning that it's sort of meshed together with Christianity. So the Christianity that was introduced in the area meshed together with these Bwiti ideas. But there it's used as an initiation substance. So people take large quantities for the purposes of initiation, which is to say to enter into adulthood, ritually speaking. But it's also used by the sort of indigenous shamanic culture, often to do sort of diagnostic and healing and visionary work and so on and so forth. So when they isolate from the Iboga, they isolate ibogaine. That's really just one of many alkaloids which are naturally present. So you have to always pay attention to these things a little bit, because whether or not you're getting a broad spectrum effect of lots of different psychoactives and how different that is than isolating a single psychoactive is a pretty live question in the field. You know, the same thing, of course, applies to any of these sort of naturally occurring compounds. Are you in fact getting the same thing if you are isolating, right, the sort of a single chemical thing and administering it, as you are if you're taking it in, you know, a more sort of naturalized indigenous context? Iboga is of particular interest to me. So Iboga was, loosely speaking, introduced to the West by a guy named Howard Lotsof. And in 1967, Howard Lotsof was sort of taking a tour through, he's an American, he was taking a tour through Europe and Africa, and more or less sort of eating any, you know, mind-altering substances he could get his hands on. And so, you know, he ended up in Africa and took Iboga and had a sort of a 3-day long experience. But what was quite striking to him about this experience, which again typically induces really powerful vomiting, and it goes on for a long time. 3 days is a long time. But what really struck him was that when he woke on the far side, by his account, he was no longer addicted to heroin, which he was quite addicted to prior. And the anti-addictive properties of Iboga and ibogaine have now been studied, not nearly as extensively as ayahuasca and some of these other compounds, but it's been studied pretty extensively. I actually think it's a compound which there are some potential health risks around it. It's been linked to cases of sort of respiratory failure, rarely, but you know, often enough for that to be something of concern. And it's an extremely powerful substance in this way. But it hasn't received nearly as much clinical attention. It is, I add, legal in Canada, but quite scheduled in the States. So there it is, you know, scheduled at their sort of maximum level of penalty. Here, it's unscheduled. It's legal, but you don't see very much of it. It's not the kind of thing that really admits to sort of popular experimentation, right? It isn't sort of magic mushrooms or something of this kind that people feel somewhat comfortable experimenting, although I would caution people in that respect too. So that's an interesting compound as well that's starting to see some application. Another one that's starting to see some application, again, as I mentioned, is MDMA. MDMA, interestingly, saw something of a resurgence in studies that were conducted by the US Department of Defense, where they were looking at it in the treatment of PTSD, right, post-traumatic stress disorder. And in their experiments, it showed a fairly remarkable degree of efficacy in this respect, that you could administer MDMA within a controlled clinical setting to somebody and then have them revisit their trauma. And very often it is the case that, of course, when somebody who has post-traumatic stress disorder or complex trauma, revisits the material, it becomes rapidly emotionally overwhelming and it can't be sort of properly processed. With the administration of MDMA, that aforementioned reduction in anxiety and a kind of empathic opening up appears to allow people to process things in a really significant way. And the fact that the US military, I mean, say what you will about the military, but they're sort of no nonsense a lot of the times in terms of their application. They're looking at something that is a real problem that they face, which is that troops often develop PTSD, right? The military conditions of being a soldier are quite stressful, and people develop, significant secondary effects from that. So the fact that they were investigating it probably, said a lot to people, and that has begun to have a really significant research effort put behind it too. Indeed, some of those stage 3 studies, right, because they're sort of looking to fast track it. Some of those stage 3 studies were done in collaboration with CAMH. I know a bunch of the people involved. And so that's a really promising route as well. Another one that has made sort of a recent resurge, it seems to me, is ketamine. Right, which gets maligned as it's a dissociative. It gets maligned as, a horse tranquilizer or a rave drug, right? And certainly it is the case that it's sort of used in those contexts and without control or preparation. I think that there's some danger there, as there is with any of these things. However, ketamine has seen an increasing sort of attention of off-label use because it is quite legal. So it's seen off-label use for depression treatment. And indeed, here in Toronto, there's, I believe now 2 clinics which are sort of specialized in the administration of this. I won't speak at it at great length, but I, in fact, had ketamine for the first time not very long ago. So when I had my surgery, and this was unexpected, I didn't realize that this has been the case. I've had procedures of this kind before, and but never with a general anesthetic. So when I went into the OR first, I had like a full team of people, and I was like, oh, I see, we're having a whole thing here. Big hexagonal light and multiple doctors and so on and so forth. And then they were like, okay, well, so based on your body weight and your past history, we're going to be administering ketamine. And I was like, oh, this is something that I've obviously read about pretty extensively, but not had. And I will say that it was a fascinating and powerful experience. I can understand in many ways its application in sort of depression treatment. So that speaks to, I think, one of the core things that you see coming out of sort of psychedelic psychotherapy, which is, and we'll talk a little bit about sort of dose ranges, because there's been a big move towards what's called microdosing. So the intake of sort of small, almost subperceptual doses of different kinds of psychedelics in a more ongoing way. But here first, I want to talk about sort of large dose administrations. So aside from the sort of visionary content, which seems to be part and parcel of many of these psychedelic experiences and this sort of insight fostering, right? There is also very often sort of a dissolution that occurs in terms of patterns. And when you consider, okay, that a great number of sort of these sort of core psychological issues that you're dealing with as a therapist involve certain kinds of intrusive thoughts and fixations, right? People get caught in loops, in these loops, right? These loops of intrusive thinking. So that's very common in depression. It's extremely common in anxiety. It's extremely common in obsessive compulsive disorder, right? A variety of these things where, that quality of the intrusive thinking and the loop, right? Being sort of seemingly unable to escape this relatively narrow bound of looping thoughts is what causes a great deal of the distress. And we've spoken before about the fact that our current conceptualizations of mental health conditions, such as they are, leave a lot to be desired, right? We are still figuring out the general sort of brain structure and functionality, what's actually going on here. And so we have a set of categories that contain, quite frankly, a lot of comorbidity, right? These things tend to co-occur. And because they're co-occurring so frequently, that tends to indicate sort of philosophically that we don't really have our finger on the categories as such. Like, we're sort of loosely categorizing these things as best as we can to try to figure out treatment patterns. But the fact is, like, we do not have the final formulation. We don't understand all of these things and their relationships to each other, right? Nevertheless, this obsessive and repetitious thinking and intrusive thinking is a very common pattern across a bunch of different conditions. And one of the things that seems to occur with these high dose psychedelic regimens is that they tend to sort of dissolve away those fixations, albeit temporarily, but even still, right? They tend to dissolve away those kinds of fixations. So, if you think about this in terms of depression, there is a kind of reciprocal narrowing that occurs during depression where things ratchet down. You end up with a narrower world with less possibility, right? Or fewer possibilities and less possibility, right? So you get this reciprocal narrowing in your sense of yourself and in your sense of the future. And it ends up being sort of full of, unpleasant thoughts, right? Unpleasant feelings. Anxiety tends to be a kind of an expansive sense of possibility, right, in a way, right? So with anxiety, and to a certain extent with obsessive compulsive, you have the sense that because something is possible, it's probable, right? There is this sort of expanded sense of things that often occurs where people become worried about very small possibilities, as though they were sort of significant probabilities, and they again become intrusive. So the dissolving away that occurs in this respect with psychedelic psychotherapy seems to sort of quite directly come at this particular formulation. And you can see that a bunch of these different features seem to sort of interlock with each other. So there is, often a dissolving away of the current fixation. There is, right, the expanded sense of coherence and meaning, right? There is often a set of insights about one's self, one's past, right? In many ways, the nature of being or life, etc. And all these things come together, right, to create an experience where people come out the far side, often feeling significantly transformed. Now, in terms of the exact mechanisms of action of any of these things, again, we're really in the infancy on this. There have been suggestions that sort of classical psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, etc., at least operate in part by routing sort of connection patterns in the brain around the default mode network. So the default mode network is, you can think of it as like a everyday mind in some way. And so it routes those connections around the default mode network. That accounts for a number of the features that we see in sort of classical psychedelic experience. So synesthesia, for instance, right, where you experience one sensory input in terms of the mode of another sensory input, or one cognitive input in terms of the mode of another cognitive input. So, the famous version of this being like, I can see the music, right? So it's like sound information is getting recoded as visual information. There's a cross connection. But in addition, by routing around the default mode network, it tends to reduce that sort of classic sense of being fixated within the ego, right? Things are seen with sort of fresh eyes. And that's a description that goes, really far back. Aldous Huxley in The Doors of Perception, which is, it's an older book, but also a seminal one and interesting reading. He's talking primarily about mescaline. But in that he talks, he's specifically quoting Blake and the idea that the doors of perception are cleansed, right? So there's this kind of more direct encounter with the world, which is suffused with a kind of significance and impact and so on and so forth that it doesn't normally have. People often describe their psychedelic experiences in these terms, where the everyday hits them in just a totally different way than it normally does. And if you think about the various sorts of compartmentalizations that people are using in their everyday life, often as defense mechanisms or sort of modes of dissociation where they fail to connect things together, you can see that these sorts of fresh views or novel kind of connections and insights could indeed have a quite powerfully transformative experience for people. So, as I said, there's a broad range of these things which are sort of being investigated, and the uptake in terms of the research has been remarkable, really remarkable. I've said at a bunch of conferences, it's one of these weird areas where it's, going from the position of having this stuff be really like, you don't look at that in academia, to suddenly being, a hot topic, as it were, on which there are whole conferences and things. The thing that I often say is it's weird. I'm not used to being on the winning side of a cultural argument, because I've held for a long time that these things possess really significant potential. You only have to go back and look at some of the early research or talk to people who have had these experiences who will tell you how significant and transformative they've been in order to get a sense of how they might, right, carefully administered and obviously under controlled conditions, but how they might facilitate significant changes for people. And one of the promises I think that holds out is this, and I said this in a bunch of talks, but, the kind of dirty secret in some ways, okay, of psychopharmacology is that we don't really have any curative, we don't have any curative pharmacological treatments in psychology, really. We have mostly palliative treatments. So it is as though, you like broke your leg or something and you went, no, that's a bad example. It's as though you had an infection, okay? And what you did was you went to the doctor and they were like, here's some painkillers, right? It won't resolve the infection, but, you can just keep taking these and the pain won't bother you. Whereas what we have not had heretofore within sort of the modern pharmacopoeia for mental health is things that are sort of single or low dose administration, like take this and, right, in some sense, simply significantly resolve the issue. And that is the promise that these things seem to hold out. There's a vast number of them currently under study. And if you look into it, there's been a lot of work around psilocybin, which is sort of, sort of widely available and flew under the radar a little bit. LSD is starting to get renewed attention. Mescaline is starting to get renewed attention. Ketamine is getting renewed attention. Mdma is getting renewed attention. And the list goes on and on. There are indeed sort of more exotic things in this field that have been somewhat considered, but that really is where the focus is localizing. Now, it's interesting when you look, I've been involved with some kind of advocacy, and I know a number of the people involved in trying to get psychedelic psychotherapies sort of legalized and regulated. And there's been, a lot of back and forth around what this is going to look like exactly, right? There is obviously a certain amount of lobby that's pushing for sort of just, doctor or psychologist administered. As with many such things in mental health, that, may represent a pretty significant bottleneck, just because, the number of available persons doing it would be that much smaller. And so there's been a significant push to try to offer substantial training to more ground level psychotherapists, social workers, et cetera, in this kind of modality where people would take this with a sitter, right, under set and setting kind of experience, and then have a significant stretch of sort of integrative aftercare. All right, so therapy afterwards, so possibly therapy during, depending on the dosage, but then therapy afterwards to try to sort through the experience and integrate it and try to figure out how it fits in. And there's been a great deal of discussion about, what exactly that is going to look like, whether it's going to be primarily sort of clinic-based, which seems to be the model people are operating under mostly now. So this is important because, of course, you can have, medical staff on site, right, just in case, and it's a relatively controlled setting and so on and so forth. So the clinic-based model seems to be the model that people are going with. There's been a lot of discussion about short versus long acting substances. So psilocybin also has seen a fair bit of research attention, partly because it's relatively short acting. It's, for the most part, the sort of acute phase of the effects is only a few hours, in contrast to something like LSD, which goes on for a long time, or Iboga, right? Which, if you think about Howard Lotzeff's 3-day long experience, 3 days is a long time. So, relatively short-acting kinds of experiences have seen sort of significant attention for obvious reasons. There has been in public discussion a degree of sort of interchangeability between these substances, and I think you're going to see that fall away. I think you're going to find that these things will increasingly come to be seen as being more targeted. Right now, basically it's like this careful work to just get this back into the conversation is occurring. And it really has re-entered the conversation. I mean, Oprah was talking about it like almost 10 years ago, which blew me away, right? Oprah was talking about the work, was Oprah magazine, properly speaking, but I mean, it was part of the Oprah machine, talking about the work being done with MDMA by the military. And it's like, wow, these are really establishment forces. Like, this is a sea change. Well, since then, there's been quite widespread attention academically, lots and lots of papers and conferences published, right? Centers being opened and so on and so forth, research institutes, et cetera, et cetera. There has been some movement, significant movement in recent years by sort of business interests to try to figure out how to chase this. So after, of course, the legalization of marijuana, which was something of a boom for sort of growers and producers and so on and so forth, this has really been looked at as sort of the next horizon. And that has been matched with this surge in what is often referred to as microdosing. So microdosing, rather than taking sort of a relatively large sort of visionary level of a substance, microdosing is like an ongoing administration of a low, generally speaking, kind of sub-perceptual, but maybe just on the edge dosage of something. And the research is pretty nascent at this point. They're just sort of starting to get the research on it, but in terms of anecdotal evidence that has emerged, that has been looked at in the research, people report fairly significant effects, both in terms of sort of depression treatment, but also general kind of opening up and relatedness. So microdosing of magic mushrooms, where you would take a subperceptual dose, say every 3 days, let's say, or for people that prefer a more fixed schedule, twice a week, Monday and Thursday or something. There's a book by Ayelet Waldman, which I think is quite interesting, called A Really Good Day. And this is just her account. She had no real previous experience with psychedelics, but her account of doing microdosing, I believe with LSD. So LSD microdosing over a period of time, and describing how this sort of gradually seemed to induce an opening up. It loosened her in a variety of ways. And that's something that's pretty widely reported. Of course, also, it has been sort of much picked up in the Silicon Valley scene, and I try not to be too cynical about that, but it has been proposed as kind of an alternative to ADHD medications, Ritalin and Dexedrine and Adderall, as a way of improving focus and sort of productivity. And I try to bite back my cynicism a little bit that, in the 1960s, it was turn on, tune in, drop out. But of course, in the late 2010s, it was like, increase your productivity workday, increase your productivity workday working at the Code Factory. Anyway, I certainly don't want to cast aspersions. And hopefully that does not represent a co-opting. My pretty strong suspicion is that even if it was intended to produce a co-opting, that in fact the knock-on effect would be a pretty significant change in the people and the culture of the company over time. And so my suspicion is they wouldn't exactly be able to keep the genie in the bottle, even if what they wanted was, more focused at work or whatever. So anyway, all of this is interesting, obviously, in its own right, and you can fall down the rabbit hole of investigating this stuff. There's quite a few good books on it now. Like I mentioned, Michael Pollan's book is apparently quite good. I've not read it, but if you go and you start investigating the research, start with Griffiths, and you can move out from there. If you're on Google Scholar, of course, you can just see who cited Griffiths, and you can follow an endless web work of this stuff. Yes, I will also. Yeah, I would say start with Griffiths if you're investigating it. I was going to make a few other recommendations, but if you start looking around from there, you will definitely you'll definitely sort of branch out pretty quickly into the current state of the research. So Yeah. What else is there to say here? It's all in progress. I think the next 2 years are going to see a substantial expansion of this. What the shape of that is internationally or in Canada, it's hard to say. But I have to say that I remain sort of optimistic and sort of excited at the possibility. I myself, in full disclosure, have a significant amount of experience in this space, and I consider some of the experiences that I've had to be among the most significant of my life. I've spoken about these things at conferences, and you can find those talks online. I have had some experiences in this field that really, in many ways, served to kind of break me out of sort of ruts and trenches that I was caught in a way that, in some ways at the time seemed nothing short of miraculous. Now, I do think that one needs to be exceptionally careful with such things. And that's one of the reasons that I actually invite the idea of this stuff being sort of clinically regulated, right? That there should be proper training, because the simple sort of admonitions about set and setting, it's all well and good, but really what we need to do is have some real study about how to produce positive and transformative experiences for people in a way that isn't sort of scuttling in the underground, which is where these things have been stuck for a long time. So generally speaking, I'm quite positive on it. I'm a little worried about the sort of excessive medicalization that might occur. But I think from what I've seen talking to other researchers and from what I've seen even from Harvard, there is also this real desire to look closely and respectfully at the kind of, it's certainly in the sort of natural substance cases, to look closely and respectfully at the indigenous traditions that have been using these things profitably for thousands of years, right? That have used them as part of their cultural framework and use them to, in many ways, ground their sense of humanity and their sense of the natural in a powerful way. I think there's a lot to learn there. But it's also not, it's not the last word, right? As humans, we are capable of sort of innovation. And I think that this is a space where the significant expansion that we're going to see in the relatively near future opens up broad possibilities within the mental health field that really up to this point we haven't had strong tools for, and they will require significant training. A significant part of my own practice does deal with people who are having sort of, for lack of a better term, anomalous experiences, right? Various kinds of mystical and visionary experiences. And so I'm contacted by a relatively, I mean, it's a significant subset, let's say, of my practice. People were having these kinds of experiences because I have training and experience in this area. And I think that that's going to have to be a lot more widely addressed. People are going to have to, develop experience and training and protocols around things like spiritual emergency, right? And around both some of the potential dangers, because like anything, it's a tool and not a toy. And right, it's not the case that everybody who takes a psychedelic automatically has a magic and amazing experience, right? Sometimes people do in fact have bad experiences, although, and I will say this, I think that so-called bad trips can actually be quite profoundly positive in terms of their effect, but they're also extremely unpleasant and unsettling. Nevertheless, they can have a pretty powerful transformative experience. Sometimes if you, take something that is sort of mind manifesting, which is what psychedelic means, you end up manifesting aspects of your mind that are not to your liking, right? And so truth is not always pleasant, right? And it can be very easy to be sort of lost in some ways, or to be overwhelmed. So all of that to say, it's very much a kind of open field in terms of its development. And I think you're going to see a lot of progress being made in a short period of time. The lobbying is very high. And so this represents in some ways a kind of novel aspect of the field. Pairing together more traditional practices, such as we've discussed, right, and techniques for sort of interacting with one's own mind with an eye to intentional self-transformation, together with these things as, significant accelerators and producers of experience, we're opening up possibilities in terms of sort of the treatment of people, and not just in terms of sort of mental illness per se, but in terms of sort of existential malaise, and the modern condition, all the minor things that aren't minor, right? Things that really plague people. So, to say nothing of obviously specifics like trauma treatment and so on and so forth. So it's a burgeoning field. I don't want to say too much more. If you are already familiar with the field, then what I said is going to come as very little surprise to you. But if it's not, I would suggest that you look into it. This may not be your cup of tea, and these things are not for everyone, right? Nothing is. But these things are not for everyone. But I would encourage people to look at it with an open eye. There's really like sober, careful research by concerned parties going on. And that message is really, I think, starting to get through in a way that it seems to be overturning the cultural patterns that preceded it. People are still nervous about it, but I think what you're going to find is a significant expansion in this field, and the possibilities that that offers are, well, we don't know yet, but they look very bright. So yeah, so psychedelic psychotherapy. Okay, and up next, what will we be talking about? Oh yes, we'll be talking about in the next one, dream. So I will talk to you shortly.